I sat in the formal dining room of my grandparents' estate on Father's Day, watching 25 members of my extended family toast champagne to a man who had just announced that he had legally adopted his stepdaughter. My father stood at the head of the mahogany table, his hand resting on a black walnut frame that held a certificate embossed with a gold state seal. And he smiled the kind of smile men reserve for moments they believe will define their legacy. I finally have the daughter I always deserved, he said, his voice carrying across the chandelier-lit room with the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this exact phrasing. My stepmom pressed a linen napkin to her eyes. My half-sister, 23 years old and glowing in a pearl-pink dress that matched the roses arranged in crystal vases along the table, stood and wrapped her arms around my father's shoulders. Nobody looked at me. I did not stand. I did not raise my glass. I carefully folded my hands on the ivory linen placemat in front of me and noticed the way my father's jaw tightened for just half a second when he realized I was not participating in the applause. My name is Catherine Reeves, and 2 hours before that dinner, I had walked into my attorney's office and signed a single-page activation notice that would collapse the entire legal architecture my father had spent 3 decades building. I wore a cream blazer that afternoon, the kind of garment that signaled competence without drawing attention, paired with a taupe silk shell and pearl studs my grandmother had given me when I turned 16. My hair was pulled back in a low chignon, my makeup minimal, my posture perfect. I looked like someone who belonged in that room, even though I had spent the last 6 years being systematically erased from every family photograph, every holiday card, every public acknowledgement of lineage. I looked like the daughter of a man who had built a $67 million trucking and logistics empire from a single freight contract my grandfather had secured in 1979. I looked like someone who mattered. But the truth was that my father had been preparing to replace me for years, and this dinner was simply the ceremonial conclusion of a process that had begun the moment he remarried. The adoption certificate in that black walnut frame was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a legal instrument. My father had consulted 3 separate attorneys to ensure that adopting my stepdaughter would grant her full inheritance rights, full standing in the family trust, and full access to the governance structure of the business. He wanted her name on every document. He wanted her signature on every board resolution. He wanted to rewrite the family's institutional memory so that I became a footnote, a biological inconvenience, a first marriage mistake that could be corrected through paperwork. And he wanted to do it in front of everyone who had ever known me as his child, so that the humiliation would be permanent and witnessed. What he did not know was that my grandfather, Edward Reeves, had anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal 31 years earlier, when he amended the family trust to include Clause 7.3 subsection B, a provision that automatically stripped voting authority and equity control from any primary fiduciary, who materially altered the direct bloodline's legal standing without unanimous consent from the biological inheritors. My grandfather had been a man who understood power, and he had embedded safeguards into the trust documents that most estate attorneys would never notice unless they were specifically searching for institutional traps. I had found Clause 7.3 subsection B 6 months ago, buried in a 1993 amendment that my father had never bothered to review, and I had spent those 6 months preparing the exact legal language required to activate it. If you have ever sat in a room where your own blood relatives treated you like an inconvenient stranger, if you have ever watched someone smile while they dismantled your identity in front of people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever been told that you were not enough simply because you existed, then you understand why I did what I did. This is not a story about anger. This is a story about precision. This is a story about a woman who refused to scream, refused to beg, and refused to let the people who hurt her walk away without consequences. If that resonates with you, if you have ever had to sit perfectly still while someone tried to erase you, then stay with me, because what happens next is going to show you exactly how much damage one signature can do when it is placed on the right document at the right time. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. 7 years ago, my father married a woman named Diana Hallbrook, a 41-year-old corporate event planner who had built a reputation managing high-profile galas for pharmaceutical executives and private equity founders. She had a daughter from her first marriage, a girl named Sloane, who was 16 at the time, polished and poised in the way that expensive private schools manufacture. My father met Diana at a charity auction in Manhattan, one of those black tie fundraisers where people bid $70,000 on vintage wine collections and signed sports memorabilia while pretending to care about childhood literacy. I was 29 years old, living in Boston, working as a senior financial analyst for a mid sized investment firm. I flew home for the wedding, wore a navy sheath dress that my mother had helped me pick out before she died, and watched my father marry a woman who looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that came with the house. The first year of their marriage, I was still included. My father invited me to Thanksgiving, to Christmas, to the annual summer gathering at the estate in the Adirondacks, where the extended family gathered to fish and drink and pretend we all still liked each other. But by the second year, the invitations started arriving later, with less detail, with the kind of vague language that suggested my presence was optional rather than expected. By the third year, I stopped receiving invitations entirely. My father would call me 2 days before a major holiday and say, "We are keeping it small this year, just immediate family." And I would say, "I understand," because I was raised to be polite, to never cause a scene, to absorb rejection with grace. Diana and Sloane became immediate family. I became a scheduling conflict. The business was where the real damage happened. My grandfather had structured the family trust so that control of the logistics company passed to my father when my grandfather died in 2003, but the equity was divided among the direct descendants, which at that time meant only me. My father had operational authority, but I held 33% of the voting shares through a subtrust that would fully vest when I turned 35. My father hated that. He hated that a piece of the empire he had built was legally mine, that I had standing to question his decisions, that I could theoretically block a sale or a merger or a restructuring if I chose to exercise my rights. So he started moving pieces. In year 4 of his marriage to Diana, my father amended the company's operating agreement to create a new class of non voting advisory shares, which he then distributed to Diana and Sloan as part of what he called a family alignment initiative. The shares had no real power, but they allowed him to dilute my symbolic presence in the business by creating the appearance that Diana and Sloan were stakeholders. In year 5, he restructured the board to add 2 external directors who were personal friends of Diana's, men who had no background in logistics but who owed their appointments entirely to her influence. In year 6, he moved the company's registered headquarters from New York to Delaware, a shift that required refiling the governance documents and allowed him to quietly remove my name from the primary signatory list on the corporate bank accounts. Every change was legal. Every change was documented. Every change was designed to make me irrelevant. I did not fight him. I did not call him and demand explanations. I did not threaten lawsuits or send angry emails or show up at board meetings with a lawyer. I simply watched, documented every amendment, every filing, every restructuring notice, and waited. My father interpreted my silence as weakness. He thought I was too passive, too afraid of conflict, too desperate for his approval to ever challenge him. He was wrong. The family member who saw what was happening was my uncle, my father's younger brother, a man named Philip Reeves, who had spent most of his adult life as what the family politely called the eccentric one. Philip had never married, never built a career, never accumulated wealth or status, or any of the markers the Reeves family valued. He lived in a rent controlled apartment in Brooklyn, taught philosophy part time at a community college, and showed up to family gatherings wearing corduroy jackets with elbow patches and wire rimmed glasses that made him look like a character from a 1970s academic film. My father barely tolerated him. Diana ignored him. Sloane once asked me, in front of the entire family, why we let the sad professor sit at the table during holidays. But Philip noticed everything. He called me one night in February, 6 months before the Father's Day dinner, and said, "Catherine, I need you to look at something." He had been going through boxes of my grandfather's papers that had been stored in the estate's library, documents that my father had never bothered to inventory, because he assumed they were just old tax filings and obsolete contracts. Philip had found the 1993 Trust Amendment, the one that included Clause 7.3 subsection B, and he had recognized it for what it was, a nuclear option. He mailed me a photocopy of the relevant pages in a plain manila envelope with no return address. And when I opened it at my kitchen table in Boston, I understood immediately that my grandfather had built a trap specifically designed to protect me from exactly the kind of institutional betrayal my father was executing. I contacted a trust and estate attorney named Dr. Elliot Brennan, a specialist in contested inheritance structures who had written 3 textbooks on fiduciary duty and family governance. Dr. Brennan worked out of a small firm in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of practice that handled billionaire estate disputes and multi-generational trust litigation without ever appearing in the news. He reviewed the trust documents, confirmed that Clause 7.3 subsection B was legally enforceable, and explained to me exactly what would happen if I chose to activate it. If your father adopts a non-biological child and formalizes that adoption through state certification, Dr. Brennan said, then under the language of this clause, he will automatically lose his voting authority on the business, his access to the discretionary income distributions, and his ability to unilaterally amend the trust. The equity control reverts to the biological line, which in this case means you. It is a complete institutional reset. I asked him how long the process would take once I signed the activation notice. He said, the clause is self-executing. The moment the adoption is legally finalized, the consequences trigger automatically. Your father will not receive a warning. He will simply wake up one morning and discover that he no longer controls the company he has been running for 23 years. I signed the activation notice on Father's Day, at 2 in the afternoon, in Dr. Brennan's office. The document was a single page, typed on bonded linen paper with a watermark that read, Brennan and Associates, and it contained 3 short paragraphs that formally invoked Clause 7.3 subsection B in response to my father's adoption of Sloane Diana Holbrook. I used a Mont Blanc fountain pen with blue-black ink, the same pen my grandfather had used to sign the original trust documents in 1979, and I wrote my full legal name in cursive at the bottom of the page. Dr. Brennan notarized the document, filed it with the trust's administrative custodian, and handed me a sealed envelope that contained a courtesy copy for my records. This will be processed by the custodian within 24 hours, he said. By tomorrow morning, your father's attorney will receive a formal notification that his fiduciary status has been revoked. I drove from Greenwich to the estate in upstate New York, a 2-hour trip through winding country roads, lined with stone walls and maple trees, and I arrived at the house at 4:30 in the afternoon. The estate was a sprawling Georgian colonial that my grandfather had purchased in 1968, a house with 12 bedrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves, and a formal dining room that could seat 30 people beneath a Czechoslovakian crystal chandelier that weighed 420 pounds. The driveway was already full of cars when I arrived, BMWs and Audis, and a single vintage Mercedes that belonged to my father's oldest friend, a man who had been his roommate at Dartmouth and who now served as the company's chief financial officer. I parked my car at the far end of the circular drive, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked into the house carrying nothing but my phone and the sealed envelope from Dr. Brennan. Dinner was scheduled for 6, but the family had already gathered in the sitting room, drinking champagne and eating canapes that Diana's event planning team had catered. Sloane was holding court near the fireplace, showing off a diamond bracelet that my father had given her that morning, a delicate strand of white gold set with 22 stones that she said had cost $11,800. I stood near the doorway and watched her tilt her wrist so the diamonds caught the light, and I thought about the fact that my father had never once given me jewelry, had never once celebrated my accomplishments with anything more expensive than a restaurant gift card. I did not cry, I did not leave. I carefully accepted a glass of champagne from the server circulating the room and noticed the way Diana glanced at me with the kind of cold assessment reserved for people who are being tolerated rather than welcomed. At 6, we moved into the dining room, and my father directed everyone to their assigned seats using place cards written in calligraphy on ivory cardstock. I was seated at the far end of the table, between Philip and a second cousin I had not spoken to in 5 years, positioned as far from my father as the geometry of the room allowed. Sloane sat to my father's right, Diana to his left, and the rest of the family filled in the spaces with the kind of self-sorting hierarchy that happens when people know exactly where they rank. The meal was served in courses: a chilled cucumber soup, seared scallops with lemon beurre blanc, filet mignon with roasted root vegetables, and a lemon tart with fresh raspberries. My father stood to make the announcement after the main course, when everyone was flushed with wine and good food, and the kind of performative happiness that expensive dinners generate. He lifted the black walnut frame and held it so everyone could see the certificate inside, a document printed on parchment paper with Sloane's full legal name and my father's signature and a gold seal from the state of New York. I want to share something with all of you tonight, my father said, his voice steady and warm, the voice of a man who believed he was doing something noble. 6 months ago, I began the process of legally adopting Sloane. Today, that adoption was finalized. She is now my daughter in every legal and emotional sense, and I could not be more proud. The room erupted in applause. My stepmom stood and kissed my father on the cheek. Sloane, radiant in her pearl pink dress, wrapped her arms around him and whispered something in his ear that made him laugh. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and I felt the weight of the sealed envelope in my blazer pocket like a stone. Nobody asked me how I felt. Nobody looked at me to see if I was crying or angry or hurt. I had been erased so completely over the past 7 years that my presence at the table was nothing more than a formality, a ghost invited out of obligation rather than affection. And in that moment, I understood that my father had won the public performance. He had rewritten the family narrative in front of witnesses, and there was nothing I could do to undo the humiliation of being replaced in a room full of people who had known me since I was a child. But what my father did not know, what none of them knew, was that his signature on that adoption certificate had just triggered a legal mechanism that would strip him of everything he had built. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, his attorneys would be calling him to explain that the company he thought he controlled was no longer his to command. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that precedes institutional collapse. I woke at 6 in my childhood bedroom on the third floor of the estate, a room that still contained the white iron bed frame I had slept in as a teenager and the built-in bookshelves my grandfather had commissioned when I turned 12. The sun came through the tall windows in pale gold strips, illuminating dust particles that hung in the air like suspended evidence. I did not check my phone. I did not rush downstairs to see if anyone had discovered what I had done. I simply dressed in the same cream blazer I had worn the night before, paired it with charcoal trousers and a fresh silk shell the color of bone, and walked downstairs to the breakfast room where the family traditionally gathered the morning after holiday dinners. Diana was already seated at the round table near the bay windows, wearing a cashmere wrapped dress in dove gray and pearl earrings that caught the light every time she turned her head. Sloane sat beside her, scrolling through her phone with the distracted focus of someone who had been raised to believe that other people's conversations were optional background noise. My father was not there yet. Philip sat in the corner with a cup of black coffee and a folded newspaper, and when I entered the room, he looked up and gave me the smallest, tightest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who share a secret they cannot yet speak aloud. I poured myself coffee from the silver carafe on the sideboard and took the seat farthest from Diana, positioning myself so I could see the doorway. My father arrived at 7:15, dressed in a pale blue Oxford shirt and khaki trousers, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked rested, satisfied, entirely unaware that his attorney was already reviewing a notification document that would redefine every assumption he had made about his authority. He kissed Diana on the cheek, squeezed Sloane's shoulder, and sat at the head of the table with the casual confidence of a man who believed he had just secured his legacy. "Beautiful morning," he said, reaching for the coffee. Nobody responded. Diana smiled at him with the kind of serene ownership that women display when they believe they have won a long-term strategic campaign. Sloane glanced up from her phone just long enough to say, "Are we still doing brunch at the club later?" My father said, "Absolutely." I reserved the terrace. I sipped my coffee and watched the second hand on the antique clock above the sideboard move through its slow rotations. At 7:43, my father's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and said, "Excuse me for a moment." He stood and walked into the hallway, and I heard his voice drop into the low, clipped tone he used when he was trying to control a situation he did not fully understand. Diana looked at Sloane and said, "Probably work." "Your father never stops," Sloane said. "He should delegate more." Philip folded his newspaper and met my eyes across the table, and I knew he understood exactly what phone call my father was receiving. When my father returned 10 minutes later, his face had changed. Not pale, not panicked, but tighter, as though someone had just informed him that a system he thought was automated had been running on manual override the entire time. He sat down, picked up his coffee, and said, "I need to drive into the city this afternoon. Something came up with the trust administration." Diana said, "On a holiday weekend?" My father said, "It is a clerical issue, nothing urgent." But his hand was gripping the coffee cup with enough pressure that I could see the tension in his knuckles, and I knew that his attorney had just told him that Clause 7.3 subsection B had been activated, and that the consequences were already in motion. I finished my coffee, excused myself from the table, and walked upstairs to pack my overnight bag. I left the estate at 9, driving back to Boston in my leased Audi sedan, and I did not speak to my father for the next 11 days. During that time, I received 3 voicemails from him, each one progressively more controlled and less friendly, asking me to call him back to discuss some questions that have come up regarding the family business structure. I did not return the calls. I went to work, attended meetings, reviewed financial models, and waited for the institutional machinery to finish processing the legal reset that I had initiated. On the 12th day, my father called me at 8 in the morning and said, "Catherine, we need to talk. In person, this week." His voice had the kind of forced calm that men use when they are trying very hard not to sound desperate. I said, "I am available Thursday afternoon." He said, "I will send a car." I said, "I will drive myself," and I hung up before he could argue. The meeting took place at the estate in my grandfather's library, a room lined with first edition legal texts and framed maps of shipping routes that dated back to the 1950s. My father sat behind the mahogany desk that had once belonged to my grandfather, and his attorney, a man named Gerald Pitkin who had represented the family for 30 years, sat in one of the leather wingback chairs near the fireplace. I sat across from my father and folded my hands in my lap, and I waited for him to speak first. He said, "I assume you know why I asked you here." I said, "I assume it has something to do with the trust administration." He said, "Catherine, what you did was unnecessarily hostile. We could have discussed this." I said, "You never discussed anything with me. You made unilateral decisions for 7 years and assumed I would accept them because I was too polite to fight back." Gerald Pitkin cleared his throat and said, "Miss Reeves, the activation of Clause 7.3 subsection B has created significant operational complications for the business. Your father is no longer able to sign off on contracts, approve capital expenditures, or authorize board actions without your explicit consent. Essentially, you have taken control of the company." I said, "I have not taken control. I have simply restored the governance structure that my grandfather intended." My father said, "Your grandfather never intended for you to weaponize a technicality to sabotage a family transition." I said, "My grandfather intended for the biological line to retain institutional authority. You violated that intent when you adopted Sloan." The room went silent, not in the way of shock, but in the way of two parties realizing that the negotiation has no neutral ground. My father leaned back in his chair and said, "What do you want, Catherine?" I said, "I want you to acknowledge that I am your daughter. I want you to acknowledge that you spent 7 years systematically erasing me from this family, and I want you to understand that there are consequences for that." He said, "I never erased you. I simply expanded the family." I said, "You replaced me. There is a difference." Gerald Pitkin interjected and said, "Miss Reeves, if you're willing to sign a consent waiver that restores your father's operational authority, we can structure a financial settlement that compensates you for any perceived exclusion." I said, "I do not want money, I want accountability." My father said, "Accountability for what? For loving my wife, for giving her daughter the legal security she deserves." I said, "For doing it in front of 25 people on Father's Day while pretending I did not exist." I stood, picked up my purse, and walked to the door. My father said, "Catherine, if you do not sign the waiver, this company will be paralyzed. We have contracts pending, payroll to process, investors who are asking questions. You are hurting people who depend on this business." I turned and looked at him and I said, "Then you should have thought about that before you framed that adoption certificate." I left the library, walked to my car, and drove back to Boston. That afternoon, I received an email from Gerald Pitkin offering a settlement of $2,750,000 in exchange for my signature on a consent waiver that would restore my father's full authority. I did not respond. 3 days later, the offer increased to $4,200,000. I did not respond. 1 week later, my father called me and said, "Catherine, you are going to destroy this family." I said, "No, you already did that. I am just making sure everyone sees it." The situation remained frozen for 6 weeks. My father could not operate the business without my consent, and I refused to provide it unless he publicly acknowledged what he had done. The company's board began to fracture. Two of the external directors resigned, citing concerns about governance instability. The chief financial officer, my father's oldest friend, called me and tried to broker a compromise, suggesting that my father could issue a private apology in exchange for limited operational authority. I told him that private apologies were worthless, that my father had humiliated me in public, and that any resolution would need to be equally public. The chief financial officer said, "Catherine, you are being unreasonable." I said, "No, I am being precise." During those 6 weeks, Philip called me every Sunday evening and gave me updates on the family's internal chaos. Diana had stopped speaking to my father, furious that his decision to adopt Sloan had triggered a legal crisis that was now threatening their financial security. Sloan had hired her own attorney. a young associate from a white shoe firm in Manhattan, who was advising her that she might have standing to challenge the trust's validity on the grounds that my grandfather's clause was discriminatory. My father had stopped attending family dinners, spending most of his time locked in the library making calls to estate planning specialists who kept telling him that Clause 7.3 subsection B was ironclad and that his only option was to negotiate with me. Philip said, "He is unraveling, Catherine. He thought he could control this, and now he realizes he cannot." I said, "Good. Let him unravel." The breaking point came in late August, when my father's attorney informed him that if the governance deadlock continued for another 30 days, the trust's administrative custodian would be legally required to initiate a formal review process that could result in the company being placed in temporary receivership. My father called me and said, "Catherine, I am asking you, as my daughter, to end this." I said, "I stopped being your daughter the moment you stood in front of that room and said you finally had the daughter you always deserved." He said, "I did not mean it that way." I said, "Yes, you did, and now you are going to fix it." I told him that I would sign the consent waiver on one condition. He would host a family dinner at the estate, invite the same 25 people who had attended the Father's Day celebration, and he would publicly acknowledge that he had made a mistake, that he had treated me unfairly, and that he was grateful for my willingness to restore the business rather than destroy it. My father said, "You want me to humiliate myself?" I said, "No, I want you to tell the truth." He agreed. The dinner was scheduled for the third Saturday in September, and I received a formal invitation in the mail, printed on cream cardstock with my name written in the same calligraphy that had been used for the Father's Day place cards. I drove to the estate that afternoon wearing a tailored navy suit with a silk blouse the color of winter sky, and I arrived at 5:30, exactly 30 minutes before the other guests. My father met me in the foyer, dressed in a charcoal suit and a white shirt with French cuffs, and he said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "This is not a favor, this is a condition." The guests arrived in the same luxury cars, the same expensive outfits, the same performative warmth that people use when they are pretending that nothing uncomfortable has ever happened. Diana wore a black cocktail dress with a strand of South Sea pearls, and Sloane wore a blush pink sheath with the diamond bracelet my father had given her glinting on her wrist. They both looked at me with the kind of cold assessment that women deploy when they are trying to calculate whether someone is a threat or simply an irritation. I smiled at them, polite and distant, and took my assigned seat at the dining table, which this time was positioned directly across from my father. Dinner was served in the same formal sequence: chilled soup, seared fish, roasted lamb, and a chocolate torte with gold leaf. The conversation was strained, performative, filled with the kind of benign observations about weather and travel plans that people use to avoid discussing anything real. My father barely touched his food. Diana drank 3 glasses of wine before the main course. Sloane kept glancing at her phone under the table, and at one point my father reached over and said, quietly, "Put it away," and she did, but her jaw tightened in a way that suggested she was keeping score. After dessert, my father stood and tapped his knife against his wine glass, and the room fell into the kind of expectant silence that follows a man who has something important to say. He looked at me, then at the assembled family, and he said, "I asked you all here tonight because I need to address something that happened earlier this summer. On Father's Day, I announced that I had legally adopted Sloane, and I said something that I now realize was hurtful and inappropriate. I said that I finally had the daughter I always deserved. What I should have said was that I was grateful to have Sloane as part of our family, but that statement should never have implied that my biological daughter, Catherine, was somehow insufficient or undeserving of my love and respect." The room was silent. Not shocked, not moved, but silent in the way that people are when they are waiting to see if the performative apology will be enough to satisfy the person holding the leverage. My father continued, his voice steady but lacking the warmth that had characterized his Father's Day speech. "Catherine has been extraordinarily gracious in navigating a complicated family and business situation, and I want to publicly acknowledge that I made mistakes in how I communicated my intentions. I am grateful that she has chosen to work with me to resolve the governance issues that arose, and I want everyone here to know that she is and always will be my daughter." I did not cry. I did not smile. I carefully set my wine glass on the linen placemat and looked at my father, and I said, "Thank you." The room exhaled, and Diana raised her glass and said, "To family," and everyone drank, and the dinner resumed its artificial warmth. But I knew, and Philip knew, and my father knew, that the apology had been extracted under duress, that it was a legal condition rather than a genuine acknowledgement, and that the damage between us was permanent. I signed the consent waiver the following Monday in Dr. Brennan's office, restoring my father's operational authority while retaining my equity stake and board oversight rights. The company resumed normal operations. The external directors who had resigned were replaced with candidates I personally vetted. My father returned to running the business, but now every major decision required my written approval, and he understood that I would never again be someone he could ignore. 3 months later, in early December, I received a phone call from Philip telling me that Diana had filed for separation and that Sloane had moved out of the estate to live with her biological father in Westchester. My father was living alone in the 12-bedroom house, and according to Philip, he spent most of his time in the library, reviewing contracts and avoiding the rooms where the family had once gathered. Philip said, "He destroyed his marriage trying to replace you, and now he has lost both of you." I said, "That was always the risk." I did not speak to my father again until the following spring, when he called me on my birthday and left a voicemail saying, "Happy birthday, Catherine. I hope you are well." I listened to the message 3 times, analyzing the tone, the phrasing, the absence of any real warmth or reconciliation, and I understood that he was not sorry for what he had done, only sorry that it had cost him something he valued. I deleted the voicemail and went back to work. The family business continued to operate, profitable and stable, under a governance structure that my grandfather had designed to protect the biological line from exactly the kind of institutional betrayal my father had attempted. The black walnut frame that had held Sloane's adoption certificate disappeared from the estate sometime in late autumn, and no one ever mentioned it again. My father kept the Mont Blanc fountain pen I had used to sign the activation notice locked in his desk drawer. And sometimes, according to Philip, he would take it out and stare at it, as though trying to understand how a single signature could have dismantled everything he thought he controlled. The institutional reset I had forced onto my father became the visible architecture of my victory, but what nobody understood was that it had never been the endgame. It was reconnaissance. For 6 months after I signed the consent waiver, I operated with flawless corporate compliance, attending quarterly board meetings, reviewing capital expenditure proposals, and signing off on every major contract that crossed my desk. I was professional, thorough, and entirely cooperative, and my father interpreted this behavior as evidence that I had achieved my objective and was now willing to let the family return to some version of normal operations. He was wrong. What I was actually doing was building a forensic map of every financial transaction, every amended document, every restructured account that had occurred during the 7 years of his marriage to Diana, and I was discovering that the adoption certificate had been the least damaging thing he had done. Dr. Elliot Brennan, the trust and estate attorney who had helped me activate Clause 7.3 subsection B, had referred me to a forensic accountant named Margaret Chen, a woman in her early 50s who specialized in contested inheritance audits and family business fraud. Margaret worked out of a small office in Hartford, Connecticut, and her client list included 3 billionaire families, 2 pension fund recovery cases, and a multinational pharmaceutical company that had discovered its chief financial officer had been siphoning assets through shell corporations for a decade. She did not advertise. She did not maintain a website. Her reputation was built entirely on referrals from attorneys who needed someone capable of reconstructing financial histories from incomplete records and deliberate obfuscations. I met Margaret for the first time in late October, in her office on the third floor of a converted textile factory that overlooked the Connecticut River. She wore rimless glasses, a charcoal blazer, and no jewelry except for a stainless steel watch with a black leather band. Her desk was empty except for a single closed laptop and a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen resting across it. I handed her a flash drive that contained every governance document, every board resolution, every banking statement, and every amendment my father had filed for the family business between the years of 2017 and 2024. Margaret inserted the flash drive into her laptop, opened the first file, and said, "What am I looking for?" I said, "Anything that should not be there." It took Margaret 11 weeks to complete the audit. She worked alone, reviewing thousands of pages of documents, cross-referencing account numbers, tracing fund transfers, and reconstructing transaction timelines that my father's attorneys had deliberately fragmented to avoid consolidated oversight. She called me on a Friday afternoon in mid-January and said, "Catherine, I need you to come to Hartford. There are findings you need to see in person." I drove to her office the following Monday. Margaret had printed a 73-page report and bound it in a navy blue cover with my name and the date typed on the front. She handed it to me and said, "Your father and stepmother have been systematically diverting assets from the family trust into a series of private accounts that are not disclosed in any of the governance filings. The diversions began in 2018, approximately 1 year after their marriage, and they total $9,362,411 as of last month." I did not react. I did not gasp or cry or express shock. I simply opened the report and began reading. Margaret continued, "The mechanism they used was a combination of inflated operating expenses, fictitious consulting fees paid to shell companies controlled by Diana, and unauthorized loans from the trust's discretionary income fund that were never repaid. Your father signed off on every transaction using his fiduciary authority, which at the time was legal, but the problem is that none of these transactions were disclosed to you as a beneficiary, which constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty under New York trust law. Additionally, in 2021, your father transferred $500,000 from the trust into a custodial account for Sloan that was structured to vest when she turned 25. That transfer was made without your consent and without board approval, which means it violates both the trust's governing documents and the operating agreement of the family business. I turned to the appendix, which contained photocopies of bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, and invoices for services that had never been performed. One invoice, dated March 15th, 2019, was for strategic event consulting services provided by a company called Hallbrook Advisory Group, which Margaret had traced back to a limited liability corporation registered in Diana's name. The invoice was for $78,600. Another invoice, dated November 3rd, 2020, was for executive leadership coaching provided by the same company, billed at $92,350. There were 41 invoices in total, all paid from the trust's operating account, all signed off by my father, and none of them corresponding to any actual services rendered. Margaret said, "The custodial account for Sloan is the most legally vulnerable piece. Your father used trust assets to fund an account for a non-beneficiary without authorization. That is not just a breach of fiduciary duty. That is conversion of trust property, which in New York can be prosecuted as a felony if the amount exceeds $50,000. The account currently holds $673,000, which means your father has been making additional contributions beyond the initial $500,000 transfer." I closed the report and looked at Margaret. I said, "Can this be undone?" She said, "The transfers can be reversed through a court order, but you would need to file a petition alleging breach of fiduciary duty and seek removal of your father as trustee. The court would appoint an independent fiduciary to oversee the asset recovery, and your father would be required to repay the diverted funds plus statutory interest. If he cannot repay, the court could liquidate his personal assets, including his equity stake in the business." I said, "How long would that process take?" She said, 18 to 24 months, assuming your father does not fight it. If he fights, it could take 3 to 4 years and cost several $100,000 in legal fees. I said, "What if I do not want to go to court?" Margaret said, "Then you use the report as leverage. You present the findings to your father and his attorney, you explain the legal exposure, and you negotiate a private settlement that includes full restitution, removal of Diana and Sloan from any future claims on the trust, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing." Most families prefer private settlements because they avoid public scandal and criminal prosecution. I said, "I want to think about this." Margaret said, "Take your time, but understand that the statute of limitations on some of these transactions is running. If you wait too long, your legal options will narrow." I left Hartford with the report in a leather portfolio and drove back to Boston. That night, I sat in my apartment and read the entire document 3 more times, annotating the margins with notes, highlighting specific transactions, and constructing a mental timeline of exactly when my father had decided that stealing from me was an acceptable cost of funding his new family. The custodial account for Sloan was the most infuriating piece, not because of the dollar amount, but because it represented my father's belief that he could simply transfer my inheritance to someone else, and I would never notice, never challenge, never fight back. I called Philip the next morning and asked him to meet me for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Brooklyn, a place with high-backed booths and minimal foot traffic where we could talk without being overheard. Philip arrived wearing his usual corduroy jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, and he ordered black coffee and a turkey sandwich while I explained what Margaret had found. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Catherine, this is bigger than the adoption. This is criminal." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to let him think he got away with it." Philip leaned back in the booth and studied me with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for philosophical arguments. He said, "You are not going to confront him." I said, "Not yet." He said, "You are going to let him keep operating as though nothing has changed." I said, "Exactly." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because the more comfortable he gets, the more arrogant he will become, and the more arrogant he becomes, the more mistakes he will make. Right now, he thinks the worst is over. He thinks I signed the consent waiver because I was satisfied with the public apology. He has no idea that I know about the diversions, the shell companies, the custodial account. And as long as he does not know, he will keep acting like a man who has nothing to hide." Philip said, "You are building a trap." I said, "I am documenting a crime." He said, "When do you spring it?" I said, "When the audience is large enough that he cannot deny it." For the next 4 months, I maintained perfect operational compliance. I attended every board meeting, reviewed every financial report, and signed every authorization that came across my desk. I did not ask questions about consulting fees or discretionary expenditures or custodial accounts. I was polite, professional, and entirely unremarkable, and my father visibly relaxed. He started inviting me to quarterly strategy sessions. He copied me on emails to investors. He even suggested, during a board meeting in March, that I might want to consider taking on a more formal operational role in the business, perhaps as chief strategy officer, so that I could contribute more directly to the company's long-term vision. I thanked him for the suggestion and said I would think about it. What I was actually doing during those 4 months was compiling every piece of evidence Margaret had identified, cross-referencing it with additional records I requested from the trust's administrative custodian, and building a documentary file that could be presented to either a judge or a journalist, depending on which path I ultimately chose. I kept the file in a locked drawer in my apartment, organized in chronological order, each transaction labeled with a sticky note that summarized the date, the amount, and the legal violation it represented. The custodial account documents were flagged with red tabs. The shell company invoices were flagged with yellow. The unauthorized loan records were flagged with blue. During this time, my father reached out to me with increasing frequency, not because he was concerned, but because he was feeling victorious. He called me on my birthday in April and left a voicemail saying, "Catherine, I wanted to wish you a happy birthday and tell you how proud I am of the way you have handled everything this past year. I know it has not been easy, but I think we have found a good balance, and I am grateful for your partnership." His voice was warm, paternal, entirely devoid of guilt. I saved the voicemail and added it to the evidence file under a section I had labeled Statements of Confidence. In early May, Diana sent me a text message. It was the first direct communication I had received from her in over a year, and it read, "Catherine, I hope you are well. I wanted to reach out because I think it is important for us to move past the difficulties of last year. Your father and I are committed to making this family work, and we hope you feel the same way." I did not respond immediately. I screenshot the message, saved it to a dedicated folder on my phone, and replied 3 days later with a single sentence. "I appreciate you reaching out, Diana. I am focused on my work right now, but I wish you well." Her response came within minutes. "Of course, take all the time you need." The arrogance embedded in that exchange was staggering. Diana genuinely believed that I had moved on, that the public apology my father had delivered in September had been sufficient closure, and that the family dynamics had stabilized into a configuration she could manage. She had no idea that I had spent the past 6 months mapping every dollar she had stolen, every fake invoice she had submitted, every contribution my father had made to an account that should never have existed. She thought I was weak. She thought I was compliant. She thought I had accepted my diminished role in the family because I lacked the will to fight back. Every assumption she made was evidence I could use against her. Sloane, for her part, remained entirely oblivious. She posted photographs on social media from vacations in the Amalfi Coast, from brunches at expensive Manhattan restaurants, from charity galas where she wore gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. In one photograph, posted in late May, she was wearing the diamond bracelet my father had given her on Father's Day, and the caption read, "Grateful for the family that chose me." I saved the photograph. I saved every photograph she posted, every comment she made, every public display of wealth that had been funded, at least in part, by money stolen from the trust my grandfather had established to protect me. By mid June, I had compiled a complete forensic file that included 73 pages of financial analysis from Margaret Chen, 216 pages of supporting documents, 41 fraudulent invoices, 17 wire transfer confirmations, custody account statements showing a balance of $673,000, and a timeline that demonstrated a clear pattern of coordinated asset diversion beginning in 2018 and continuing through the present. I also had recordings of 3 voicemails from my father expressing confidence in our relationship, 4 text messages from Diana attempting to normalize family relations, and 62 social media posts from Sloan displaying wealth that could be directly traced to diverted trust funds. I met with Philip in his Brooklyn apartment on a Saturday afternoon in late June. His apartment was exactly what you would expect from a man who taught philosophy at a community college. Bookshelves covering every wall, a small kitchen table covered in papers, a worn leather chair near the window where he liked to sit and read. I spread the evidence file across his kitchen table, and he spent 2 hours reviewing every document, every invoice, every bank statement. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "Catherine, this is going to destroy them." I said, "That is the point." Philip said, "What is your plan?" I said, "I am going to present this at the annual family meeting in August. My father is required to provide a financial overview of the trust and the business to all beneficiaries. That meeting is attended by every member of the extended family, including the same 25 people who were at the Father's Day dinner. I am going to let my father give his presentation, and then I am going to stand up and present this." Philip said, "He will try to stop you." I said, "He cannot. The trust bylaws give every beneficiary the right to raise concerns about fiduciary management. If he tries to silence me, it will only make him look guilty." Philip said, "What about Diana and Sloan?" I said, "They will be sitting in that room, listening to every word, and they will realize in real time that their entire financial security is built on stolen money." Philip said, "What happens after the presentation?" I said, "That depends on my father. If he agrees to full restitution, removal of Diana and Sloan from any future trust claims, and a public acknowledgement of the fraud, then I will keep this private. If he refuses, I will file a petition with the court, and this entire file will become part of the public record." Philip leaned back in his chair and said, "You have been planning this for a year." I said, "Longer than that. I have been planning this since the day he stood up with that adoption certificate and told a room full of people that he finally had the daughter he always deserved." The final 2 weeks before the August family meeting were spent organizing the physical presentation. I had Margaret print a second copy of the forensic report, which I bound in a black leather folder with gold lettering on the spine that read, "Fiduciary Audit, Reeves Family Trust, 2017 to 2024. I printed color copies of every fraudulent invoice and organized them in a 3-ring binder with labeled dividers. I created a spreadsheet that summarized every transaction, color coded by type, with a grand total at the bottom showing the full $9,362,411 in diverted assets. I saved all of the voicemails, text messages, and social media posts to a secure cloud drive with timestamps and metadata preserved for evidentiary purposes. Philip helped me assemble the presentation materials in his apartment the night before the meeting. We worked in silence, collating pages, checking labels, ensuring that every document was in perfect chronological order. At one point, Philip held up one of the invoices for Hallbrook Advisory Group and said, "She really thought she would never get caught." I said, "She thought I was too passive to investigate. She thought my silence was weakness." Philip said, "Your silence was patience." I arrived at the estate at 9 in the morning on the day of the family meeting, carrying the black leather folder and the 3-ring binder in a canvas tote bag that had belonged to my mother. The meeting was scheduled to begin at 10, in the same formal dining room where my father had announced Sloane's adoption 14 months earlier. I walked into the house wearing a tailored black suit with a white silk blouse, my hair pulled back in a low bun, my face composed and entirely unreadable. My father was already in the dining room, setting up his laptop and projector for the financial presentation he was required to deliver. He looked up when I entered and said, "Good morning, Catherine. I am glad you are here." I said I would not miss it. Diana and Sloane arrived together at 9:45, both dressed in summer pastels, both carrying designer handbags, both smiling with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from believing you have won every battle worth fighting. Diana kissed my father on the cheek. Sloane took a seat near the head of the table and immediately pulled out her phone. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them acknowledged my presence. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours, I was going to stand in front of the entire family and dismantle every illusion they had built. The other family members began arriving at 10, filling the dining room with the familiar sounds of polite greetings and small talk about summer vacations and upcoming weddings. My father called the meeting to order at 10:15, welcomed everyone, and began his financial presentation with a PowerPoint slide that showed the company's revenue growth over the past 5 years. He spoke for 45 minutes, describing operational improvements, new contracts, expanded market share, and projected earnings for the coming fiscal year. He was confident, articulate, and entirely convincing, and when he finished, the room applauded. He said, "Are there any questions?" I raised my hand, and every person in that room finally looked at me for the first time that morning. My father looked at me with the kind of patient tolerance men reserve for interruptions they consider manageable, and he said, "Yes, Catherine, what is your question?" I stood, walked to the head of the table, and set the black leather folder and the three-ring binder on the polished mahogany surface with enough deliberate care that the sound of their placement created a physical punctuation in the room. I said, "I do not have a question. I have a presentation." My father's expression shifted from patience to confusion, and he said, "Catherine, this is not the time for additional presentations. We have already reviewed the financial overview." I said, "You reviewed the operational financials. I'm going to review the trust financials, which is my right as a beneficiary under the bylaws that govern this meeting." My father glanced at Gerald Pitkin, his attorney, who was seated near the fireplace. Gerald cleared his throat and said, "Miss Reeves, if you have concerns about the trust administration, those can be addressed in a separate meeting." I said, "No, they will be addressed now in front of the same family members who were present when my father announced Sloane's adoption 14 months ago." The room went silent, not with shock, but with the kind of uncomfortable anticipation that settles over people who sense that something unpleasant is about to become unavoidable. Diana leaned forward in her chair and said, "Catherine, I do not think this is appropriate." I said, "I do not recall asking for your opinion, Diana." I opened the black leather folder and removed the 73-page forensic report that Margaret Chen had prepared. I held it up so everyone in the room could see the title printed on the cover: Fiduciary Audit, Reeves Family Trust, 2017 to 2024. I said, 6 months ago, I commissioned an independent forensic audit of all financial transactions involving the family trust and the business during the period of my father's marriage to Diana Hallbrook. What the audit revealed is that my father and stepmother have systematically diverted $9,362,411 from the trust into private accounts and shell companies that are not disclosed in any governance filings. These diversions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty under New York trust law, and in some cases, they constitute criminal conversion of trust property. The room erupted. Not with gasps or screams, but with the kind of low, urgent murmuring that happens when people realize they are witnessing something that will have consequences. My father said, "Catherine, that is a serious accusation, and it is completely false." I said, "It is not an accusation. It is a documented fact." I opened the three-ring binder and removed the first invoice, the one dated March 15th, 2019, for $78,600 paid to Hallbrook Advisory Group. I held it up and said, "This is an invoice for strategic event consulting services that were never performed." The company listed as the vendor, Hallbrook Advisory Group, is a limited liability corporation registered in Diana's name. My father signed off on this payment using his fiduciary authority, and the money was transferred directly into an account controlled by Diana. Diana stood, her face pale but her voice controlled, and she said, "That invoice is for legitimate consulting services I provided to the company." I said, "Then you will be able to provide documentation of those services. Work product, meeting notes, deliverables, anything that proves you actually performed the work you were paid for." Diana said, "Those records are in storage." I said, "Convenient." I turned to the next invoice, dated November 3rd, 2020, for $92,350, and I said, "This is another invoice for executive leadership coaching, also billed by Hallbrook Advisory Group, also paid without any documentation of services rendered." There are 41 invoices like this in the file, totaling $4,127,000, all paid from the trust's operating account, all signed off by my father, and none of them corresponding to any actual work. My father stood and said, "Catherine, this is a misunderstanding. Diana provided consulting services to the company during a period of strategic growth. Those invoices reflect legitimate business expenses." I said, then why were they never disclosed to me as a beneficiary? Why were they never reviewed by the board? Why were they paid from the trust's discretionary fund instead of the company's standard operating budget? My father said, because they were routine operational expenses that did not require board approval. I said, according to the trust's governing documents, any payment exceeding $50,000 to a related party requires written disclosure to all beneficiaries. You violated that requirement 41 times. I turned to the next section of the binder and removed a set of bank statements showing the custodial account my father had established for Sloan. I said, in 2021, my father transferred $500,000 from the trust into a custodial account for Sloan Holbrook, my stepsister, who is not a beneficiary of the trust and has no legal claim to its assets. That transfer was made without my consent, without board approval, and without any authorization under the trust documents. As of last month, that account holds $673,000, which means my father has continued making contributions to an account that should not exist. Sloan, who had been sitting in silence with her phone face down on the table, finally looked up and said, I did not know where that money came from. My dad just told me he was setting up an account for my future. I said, your dad used money that belonged to me to fund your future, and he did it without asking, without disclosing, and without caring that it was illegal. Sloane's face flushed and she said, I did not ask him to do that. I said, that does not make it legal. I picked up the Mont Blanc fountain pen that I had placed on the table next to the binder, the same pen my grandfather had used to sign the original trust documents in 1979, the same pen I had used to sign the activation notice that triggered Clause 7.3 subsection B. I held it up and said, this pen has been in my family for 45 years. My grandfather used it to build the legal structure that was supposed to protect his descendants from exactly the kind of theft you have been committing for the past 7 years. I used it to activate the clause that stripped you of your authority. And now I am using it to document every crime you thought I would never discover. My father's face had gone from confusion to anger to something that looked very much like fear, and he said, Catherine, if you take this to court, you will destroy this family. I said, you already destroyed this family when you stood in this room 14 months ago and told everyone that you finally had the daughter you always deserved. I turned to the assembly and said, that black walnut frame my father held up on Father's Day, the one with Sloane's adoption certificate, cost $11,800. The same amount he spent on the diamond bracelet he gave Sloane that morning. I know because I reviewed the credit card statements from the trust's discretionary account. He used my inheritance to buy the props for his performance. I set the pen down and picked up the final document in the binder, a summary spreadsheet that showed every diverted transaction organized by date, amount, and recipient. I said, the total amount stolen from this trust is $9,362,411. I am demanding full restitution within 90 days, the immediate closure of the custodial account with all funds returned to the trust, the removal of Diana and Sloan from any future claims on the trust or the business, and a formal written acknowledgement from my father that he breached his fiduciary duty and engaged in criminal conversion of trust property. If those conditions are not met, I will file a petition with the New York Surrogates Court, and every document in this file will become part of the public record. I will also refer the matter to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution, because conversion of trust assets exceeding $50,000 is a Class E felony in this state. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for someone to finish speaking, but the absolute silence of people who have just realized they have been sitting in a room with someone who has been systematically dismantled in front of them. My father sat down slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the table, and he said, Catherine, we can discuss this privately. I said, no, you humiliated me publicly. I am holding you accountable publicly. Diana stood and said, you are doing this out of spite. I said, no, I am doing this because you are a thief, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. I closed the binder, picked up the black leather folder, and walked out of the dining room. Philip followed me into the hallway, and as we walked toward the front door, I heard the sound of voices erupting behind us, family members demanding explanations, my father trying to regain control, Diana's voice rising in anger. Philip said, that was the most controlled act of destruction I have ever witnessed. I said, it was not destruction, it was disclosure. Within 72 hours, my father's attorney contacted Dr. Brennan to propose a settlement. The initial offer was full restitution of the $9,362,411, closure of the custodial account, and a written acknowledgement of the fiduciary breach. I rejected the offer because it did not include removal of Diana and Sloan from future trust claims. The second offer, delivered 1 week later, included all of my original conditions plus an agreement that Diana would file for divorce within 90 days and that Sloan would sign a formal waiver renouncing any claim to the trust or the business. I accepted. The restitution was funded through the liquidation of assets my father and Diana had accumulated during their marriage. The house they had purchased together in Westchester, a 6-bedroom colonial that Diana had decorated with the money stolen from the trust, was sold for $3,200,000. The vacation property they owned in the Hamptons was sold for $2,800,000. Diana's leased Mercedes, the pearl gray sedan she had driven to every family gathering, was returned to the dealership. The South Sea pearl necklace she had worn to the September apology dinner was sold at auction for $67,000. Sloane's custodial account was drained and the funds returned to the trust, and she was required to return the diamond bracelet my father had given her on Father's Day, which was sold to a private buyer for $9,500. My father remained as operational head of the business, but only because I allowed it, and only under a revised governance structure that required my written approval for every transaction exceeding $25,000. Diana moved out of the estate in early October and filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The settlement stripped her of any claim to the family business, the trust, or any assets that had been funded with diverted money. Sloan, who had briefly considered challenging the trust's validity, dropped the idea after her attorney explained that she had no legal standing and that pursuing the case would likely result in her being held liable for receiving stolen property. In mid-November, I received a handwritten letter from my father. It was written on cream stationery in black ink, and it began with the words, "Catherine, I am writing to apologize." The letter was 3 pages long, and it contained all of the expected elements: expressions of regret, explanations of circumstance, assurances that he had never intended to hurt me. The final paragraph read, "I hope that in time, you will find it in your heart to forgive me, and that we can rebuild some version of a relationship. You are my daughter, and I love you, even if I have done a terrible job of showing it." I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a file folder labeled Correspondence 2024. I did not respond. By January, the restitution was complete. The trust's balance had been restored to its proper level, the custodial account no longer existed, and Diana and Sloan had been formally removed from all governance documents. My father continued to run the business, but he did so with the knowledge that every decision he made was subject to my review, and that I would never again be someone he could manipulate, ignore, or replace. 6 months after the family meeting, I was sitting in my apartment in Boston on a Sunday morning in late February. The apartment was on the 20th floor of a building overlooking the Charles River, and the windows faced east so that the morning sun filled the space with clean, white light. I was wearing a cream cashmere sweater and charcoal trousers, the kind of effortlessly expensive clothing that signals success without announcing it. I had a cup of black coffee in a white ceramic mug, and I was standing by the window, looking out at the river and the city beyond, when I realized that for the first time in 7 years, I felt entirely at peace. What I learned from this experience, what I need you to understand if you are sitting in a room right now feeling erased, dismissed, or systematically diminished by people who are supposed to love you, is this: first, silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. The people who hurt me interpreted my calm as passivity, my lack of reaction as acceptance, and they made the fatal mistake of believing that I would never fight back. But I was not passive, I was patient. I was documenting every violation, every theft, every humiliation, and I was waiting for the moment when I could present the evidence in a way that left no room for denial. If someone is hurting you, do not feel obligated to scream. Sometimes the most powerful response is to stay quiet, stay focused, and let them believe they have won until you are ready to show them otherwise. Second, narcissistic family systems operate on the assumption that certain people are disposable. In my family, I was disposable because I was not compliant, because I had boundaries, because I refused to pretend that my father's remarriage had not fundamentally altered my place in the family structure. The moment I became inconvenient, I was replaced. But what narcissistic families do not understand is that the people they discard are often the ones who hold the most institutional power, the most legal standing, and the most capacity to dismantle the illusions they have built. If your family has decided you are disposable, understand that their decision is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their fear that you will one day hold them accountable. Third, justice does not require rage. I did not scream at my father. I did not cry in front of Diana. I did not publicly humiliate Sloane beyond what was necessary to reclaim what had been stolen from me. I simply presented the facts, demanded restitution, and walked away. Rage is exhausting, and it gives the people who hurt you the satisfaction of knowing they still have emotional power over you. Justice, real justice, is calm. It is methodical. It is the quiet certainty that you have the evidence, the legal standing, and the moral authority to demand accountability, and that no amount of manipulation or gaslighting can change that. Fourth, the people who steal from you will always try to reframe theft as generosity. My father called the custodial account he set up for Sloane a gift, a gesture of love, an investment in her future. But it was not his money to give. It was mine, and he took it without asking because he believed I would never notice or never care enough to fight back. If someone in your family is taking things that belong to you, whether that is money, property, recognition, or emotional space, and they are framing it as something noble or loving, understand that they are lying. Theft does not become generosity just because the thief smiles while they take from you. Fifth, protecting your peace will cost you relationships, and that is not a failure. I lost my relationship with my father. I lost whatever fragile connection I had with my extended family. I became the person who disrupted the family's carefully constructed narrative, and I know that some of them will never forgive me for that. But what I gained was my dignity, my financial security, and the absolute certainty that I will never again allow someone to treat me as though I do not matter. If protecting your peace means walking away from people who refuse to respect you, then walk away. The cost of staying is always higher than the cost of leaving. I finished my coffee, set the mug on the windowsill, and looked out at the city. Somewhere in that city, my father was sitting in his office, reviewing contracts he could no longer sign without my approval. Somewhere in Westchester, Diana was living in a rented apartment, stripped of the wealth and status she had stolen. Somewhere in Manhattan, Sloane was working an entry-level job, the diamond bracelet and the custodial account both gone, replaced with the reality that her lifestyle had been built on money that was never hers. And I was here, in my apartment, in my city, in the life I had built for myself, entirely free of the people who had tried to erase me. If you are reading this, if you have ever been told that you are not enough, that you are too sensitive, that you should just let things go and stop causing problems, I need you to hear this. You are not the problem. The people who hurt you are the problem. The systems that protect them are the problem. And you have every right to demand accountability, to set boundaries, and to walk away from anyone who treats your existence as negotiable. You do not owe forgiveness to people who have never apologized. You do not owe loyalty to people who have never protected you. You owe yourself peace, dignity, and the absolute certainty that your life belongs to you, not to the people who tried to take it. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.